China announced on Friday that they will raise tariffs on U.S. goods from 84% to 125%, the latest in a back-and-forth trade war between the world's two largest economies and one that has rattled markets and raised fears of a global economic slowdown. Jason Oxman, president and CEO of the Information Technology Industry Council, which represents the world's most innovative tech companies, is with us now. Jason, thank you so much for joining us this Friday. We saw that the United States' tariff policy went into effect on Wednesday, and some of those tariffs have already been paused, depending on what country we're talking about. But how is this shifting tariff policy impacting American consumers?
Well, I think the concern here is that the trade policy needs to focus on a long-term strategic goal of entering into actual trade agreements. And that's where we hope the president will be focused moving forward. Look, 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the U.S. So for the economic success of American companies, having access to global markets is incredibly important. So if we can move forward to entering into trade deals with our partners around the world, that'll be great for U.S. manufacturing, great for U.S. innovation, great for U.S. job creation.
Let's talk a little bit more about these China tariffs, because those do remain in effect, and they are more than 100% right now. We were kind of reading that in the introduction. The U.S. imports a ton of products from China. Which consumer products will that impact here in the United States, and when do we expect to see those impacts?
Well, I'm optimistic that we can move in a good direction with the U.S.-China trading relationship. It is a very complicated relationship. There are a lot of challenges with the way that China does business. And President Trump, during his first term, entered into a trade agreement with China. We're hoping we can build on that. As you noted, there's a lot of business that happens in China, a lot of exports of U.S. goods to China, a lot of imports of Chinese goods in the United States. It's a very important multi-hundred billion-dollar bilateral relationship. And I do think it's very important, since nobody wins in a trade war, for us to find a way to move forward. And again, we have a path to that. And that path is what President Trump did with President Xi just a few short years ago, and that is enter into a trade agreement between the U.S. and China. That's where I hope we'll move, and I think that'll be beneficial to U.S. economic opportunity around the world, not just for manufacturing opportunities, but also the opportunity to reach massive markets internationally as well.
Sure, and we actually heard the White House press secretary. She was pushed about whether President Trump is going to pick up the phone and call Chinese President Xi Jinping anytime soon. It wasn't clear who needs to make the first step here. But while we wait for a potential deal between the U.S. and China, how do these tariffs impact the technological products that we use every day, like our iPhones, which we are hearing may go up in price depending on how long the Chinese tariffs stay in effect?
It's an excellent question, because supply chains are global and they are enormously complicated. And at the same time that President Trump is correctly focused on bringing manufacturing to the U.S., we do need to recognize that you can't just build a manufacturing capability overnight, and that there are a lot of elements of those global supply chains, particularly in the technology industry, but really in all industries, that are international in their scope and are simply not available in the United States. And that fact means that we do need to be prudential in making sure that we consider those global supply chains when making trade decisions. That's why trade agreements among nations between the U.S. and other nations are so important, to make sure those global supply chains are not interrupted and U.S. consumers can continue to enjoy the products that they know and love.
I read something today that more than like 90% of consumer electronics are made outside of the United States. So do you expect to see prices on televisions, computers, phones, the new Nintendo consoles, do you expect to see those prices rise temporarily?
Well, certainly companies are going to have to make decisions on their pricing based on the input costs of those units. You noted televisions as an example. Televisions have not been manufactured in the United States for many, many decades. And it's a reminder that supply chains are global. And I haven't heard any companies announce that they're going to move television production back to the United States. But I think that's an example of how U.S. consumers benefit from those global supply chains.
You've been mentioning and talking about how the global economy is so interconnected. And I wonder if these lower tariffs on imported goods from Europe, because we know that Europe still has some of these tariffs right now, it's a lot less than what China is facing. But could those tariffs have a broader implication for our relationship with European countries if we are still placing tariffs on Europe when they're supposed to be an ally to the United States?
Yeah, I think that's a good example of how the hope that we have certainly is that we'll move forward and rely not on tariffs, but on trade agreements for negotiations. The European Union is a great example. We have a great bilateral relationship. The transatlantic business relationship is particularly important. It's a multi-trillion-dollar economic relationship between the U.S. and Europe. Europe buys a lot of stuff from the U.S., and that's important that we move forward. And as you noted, it raises questions in the minds of international partners when the United States appears to be entering into a tariff-focused trade policy. Tariffs are a tool and in some cases can be useful, but they're no replacement for trade agreements. So the ideal scenario, as you noted, is we get back to negotiating trade deals with our partners so that the EU and other international partners around the world see the United States as an ally in economic relations, and that U.S. companies have access to those international markets. Particularly in the technology industry, if we look at artificial intelligence and data centers, which is a key focus of technology innovation, we want to see those markets continue to grow in the U.S., and we want to see around the world purchases of U.S. technology from our friends and allies.
Are you concerned that these tariffs could stifle U.S. innovation, and how can the administration avoid that?
Yeah, tariffs in the long term certainly could stifle innovation. And the reason for that is they impose a trade war on our partners that we don't want to see, because U.S. companies need access to global markets. Again, that 95% of the world's consumers that live outside the U.S., they need access to U.S. technology and U.S. innovation, and U.S. companies need access to those markets. Tariffs in the short term, it's harder to predict what the impact will be, but we do know that over time, in the long term, if we look back at history, elevated tariffs are a damper on the U.S. economy, they're a damper on U.S. innovation, and we don't want to see that become the long-term strategy of the U.S. So we're urging the Trump administration to view those tariffs as a short-term tool, and indeed, we've seen the president and his senior team speak about how the imposition and then the pausing of tariffs have been somewhat inspirational to a lot of foreign governments to enter into trade negotiations with the U.S. We've heard about 75 countries or more asking the U.S. administration to enter into trade negotiations. We're hoping that moves quickly. ITI is very focused on helping the administration move those deals forward to completion. And if we end up there, that will be a very good place for the U.S. economy, for U.S. job creation, for manufacturing and innovation.
Well, Jason, thank you for coming on and breaking down this complicated topic, but it will have real-world impacts for our viewers, for Americans. So thank you so much for joining us, Jason Oxman, President and CEO of the Information Technology Industry Council. Thank you.
Thank you.